where the past comes alive.
Religion tackles the tough questions. Questions of birth, death, and the purpose of life. Yet faith itself is a realm of unknowns. Hi, I'm Peter Woodward. Welcome to the History Channel. The ancient land of Egypt is tied to 4 of the world's major religions, from the many gods of the pharaohs to the one God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Egypt's dominant religion today. In the West, the true nature of Islam is often misunderstood. Like most Christians and Jews, the majority of Muslims share a reverence for life and a respect for other faiths. These interwoven religions all found inspiration and innovation in Egypt, land of the gods.
Not many places on the planet can claim to be the birthplace of even a single major religion. Egypt is native soil for 2. In ancient times, a pantheon of animal-headed gods decided the fate of pharaoh and commoner alike.
The Egyptians have this polarity with regard to their deities. They can be beneficent and they can be malevolent.
In later centuries, Egypt gave rise to its own brand of Christianity, the Coptic Church.
There are many parallels between Egyptian religion and Christian teaching.
The roots of Judaism can also be traced to Egypt through biblical accounts of Moses and the Exodus. Ultimately, Islam swept across the land, and Cairo became known as the City of 1,000 Minarets. The cradle of religion, next on Egypt, land of the gods. Osiris, Moses, Amun, Jesus, Isis, Muhammad. The astonishing list of names that have inspired religious belief in Egypt has no parallel anywhere on earth. This rich tapestry of traditions reaches back some 5,000 years. It is no accident that the tangible remains of ancient Egyptian civilization are primarily religious structures. Religion, more than any other concern, energized this accomplished people. It was the bond that anchored Egyptians to the land, to their king, and to eternity. Despite the ravages of time, these monuments still project a sense of serenity and permanence. Here, a fundamental belief of Egyptian religion, the importance of preserving a balanced and stable universe, was proclaimed in stone.
The idea of cosmic order was fundamental to the Egyptian psyche because all things that they valued and knew of, for example, the sun coming up each day and setting each evening to come up the following day, the Nile rising each summer in the inundation, the king ruling justly, all of these things were encompassed in a concept called Ma'at, or truth, or cosmic harmony.
When the cosmos was thrown into disorder, the Egyptians could expect famine, flood, plague, or war, not to mention personal misfortunes such as miscarriage, snakebite, or failed romance. The purpose of religion was to avert such outbreaks of chaos.
Egyptians have got a very strong sense they belong to an orderly world which is continually being threatened by an incredibly powerful, disorderly world that lies outside of it. That same vision of a threatened cosmos is shared by every level of Egyptian society.
These concerns remained constant throughout the 3 main periods of ancient Egyptian history: the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, a span of time lasting more than 1,500 years. From the beginning, the Egyptians worshipped a changing hierarchy of gods and goddesses in which there were both national and local deities. On occasion, a local god might be elevated to national prominence. Egyptian deities were the guardians of cosmic order, but they also embodied the dangers that threatened it. Many of these gods were inspired by elements of the natural world.
Egyptian religion, or what we call Egyptian religion, was really the way the Egyptians looked at the world and tried to explain it to themselves. Things like air. What is air? What is the wind? Try to explain that to yourself without having the benefit of 4,000 years of scientific knowledge behind you. It's a being of some sort, and because it's not on the human level, it's superhuman, and therefore it's a god.
Ancient Egyptian texts recount several creation myths. The earliest and most widely known describes a dark, watery, primordial chaos. Out of this emptiness, a family of 9 creator gods were said to have brought forth everything in the universe. 3 descendants of these creator gods became the major players in Egypt's central religious myth. Isis, a fiercely protective mother goddess, Osiris, god of the underworld, and their ambitious brother, Seth. According to the legends, Seth murdered and dismembered Osiris during a struggle over royal succession. Isis revived Osiris and conceived with him a child, Horus. Ultimately, Horus became the rightful king after his own battle with Seth.
Interesting god, Seth. Because of the episode with Osiris and Horus where he dismembers his brother, he has a very, very unsavory reputation, let us say. And he becomes the god of chaos and the god of anarchy, the god of the deserts.
Desert creatures like scorpions and snakes were the first to become identified with Seth. Later, the hippopotamus and crocodile were also seen as embodiments of Seth and the destructive power of chaos. Small statuettes that show the child Horus grasping and trampling dangerous animals symbolized his mythic victory over Seth. These figures were thought to magically protect their owners from harm. The name Horus actually means "he who is above," and the falcon became the most important visual symbol of Horus. In the sometimes confusing Egyptian pantheon, the falcon also represented another important deity, Re, the sun god. Egyptians viewed the daily rising of the sun as a rebirth of Re, a sign that the cosmos was in order. However, each sunset brought darkness, the death of Re, and the renewed threat of chaos. According to ancient myths, each night Re descended into the underworld in his bark or boat. He had to traverse this realm of perils in order to be reborn the next morning.
The Egyptians believed that the sun god is on this boat, and it's making this nocturnal journey, and at every turn there's a demon out to swallow him, to impede him from dawning in the morning. And one of the most horrific beasts is this snake Apophis, whose only role in life is to impede the progress of the sun.
Re's unlikely ally in the battle against Apophis was none other than Seth. To the ancient Egyptians, one of the best ways to fight chaos was to enlist the gods who controlled it.
The Egyptians have this polarity with regard to their deities. They can be beneficent and they can be malevolent. If Seth is such a holy terror and you can harness that power for good, he no longer becomes the evil genius of our pantheon. So Seth rides the bark of Re in the nocturnal journey, beating up Apophis. The idea of turning evil against itself, fighting fire with fire, is defined by a Greek term alexikakoi, literally meaning to change evil, to avert evil. So you turn something that is potentially harmful into something that becomes beneficial.
There are numerous examples of this theological jiu-jitsu. The Egyptians personified warfare and plague in the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet. Yet the priests of Sekhmet often specialized in medicine, in effect, tapping the power of the plague goddess to cure illness.
By placating the goddess, she turns from a ferocious lioness into a kind of like kind, gentle little pussycat.
Similarly, the Egyptians placated the god Sobek, hoping for protection from crocodiles. While the ferocity of the hippopotamus could represent Seth, it was also seen as the ferocity of a protective mother and embodied in the goddess Teweret, guardian of pregnant women. In contrast, two of the most important deities, Isis and Osiris, were known primarily for positive attributes. The Egyptians looked to Osiris for regenerative power that echoed his own rebirth after being murdered by Seth. Osiris was seen as the power that made seeds germinate. He was the force that infused the dead with eternal life. Isis was the foremost protector of fertility and family life, reflecting her role in the epic myth. One of the most revered of deities, Isis would even be worshipped by Egypt's conquerors. Ultimately, the Egyptians' complex but ingenious pantheon allowed them to see the universe as a place that was explainable, and maybe even controllable. Through proper ritual and generous offerings, the Egyptians hoped to persuade their gods to rein in chaos. But the vital task of placating Egypt's all-powerful deities required an individual of immense status. Only one person could fill this role, the mightiest of all Egyptians, the god-king known as Pharaoh. This is the face of Egyptian religion. So is this. And this. For thousands of years, great kings towered over the Egyptian landscape, eternally confident and serene. They were pillars of the cosmos, architects of an orderly universe. And to ordinary Egyptians, they were nothing less than living gods.
The Egyptians thought of the pharaoh as a human being. But this human being was unlike all others. The pharaoh could say, "Build me a temple over here," and a temple would be built. A peasant could say, "Build me a temple over here," and nothing would happen. The difference is that the pharaoh has a divine force of authority within him. The peasant doesn't.
At every temple, it was the pharaoh who symbolically acted as the link between humanity and the gods. Egypt's kings are shown on countless temple walls and columns, making offerings to various deities. In return, the gods were expected to bring about a world of harmony, a world in which the fertilizing Nile would rise, the sun would be reborn each dawn, and foreign armies would be kept far from Egypt. The largest temples were dedicated to deities of national stature, like Re, the sun god, Ptah, creator god of Memphis, and Amun, king of all the gods. The ongoing religious rituals of a temple, commonly known as the temple cult, were performed by an elite priesthood to benefit the entire nation. Most Egyptians did not take part in or even witness such rites. There were a few occasions when ordinary Egyptians might glimpse the god, or even ask for divine help in matters of personal concern. One of the most important of these events was the festival of the Opet at Karnak.
This is an annual festival, once a year, and it involved the god Amun of Karnak and his statue being placed in a shrine, and the shrine being placed on a ceremonial boat, which in turn was placed on the shoulders of priests. And these priests would leave the temple, and people could crowd around the god. We have many oracle texts. This is a time when people would come and actually consult the god and ask for advice from the god because it was easier to get to him because he was out of the temple.
Similar festivals took place at other temples. Although there were literally hundreds of gods, some experts believe that ancient Egyptian religion also included a form of monotheism, the belief in a single god. This concept can be traced to Egypt's best-known creation myth, in which 9 original gods fashioned the universe, including all the other deities. The first and most important of the 9 creator gods was Atum.
When people look at Egypt and think of all these different gods, in many ways it was all one god, all deriving from this original all god. And in fact, his name Atum does mean the all god.
As time passed, Atum became linked with another deity in the pantheon, a local god named Amun. Eventually, Amun emerged as Egypt's preeminent deity, the new all-god.
Amun is the single greatest force in the universe. The power of the sun in the sky can be understood as a manifestation of Amun's kingship. The power of writing, of intellectual creation, embodied in the gods Thoth and Ta, could be understood as manifestations of Amun's intellectual processes. You can explain the world to yourself by many different gods, many different forces and elements, but also one God, because all of these can be facets of a single God. You could say the Egyptians, for a great deal of their history, were monotheists, but they were also polytheists. One God was one explanation of how the universe worked, but not the only explanation.
The seemingly odd coexistence of monotheism and polytheism within pharaonic religion continued through most of ancient Egyptian history. There was, however, one exception: the epic religious revolution of the New Kingdom pharaoh Akhenaten, the so-called heretic king. Egypt is a life-size time capsule, a living memory of the pharaonic religion that thrived here for untold generations. Temple carvings show the secret rituals acted out within their walls for centuries. Inscriptions preserve the words of long-dead priests. Yet scattered fragments are all that remain from one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of Egyptian religion. His given name was Amenhotep IV. He became pharaoh in 1353 BC, successor to one of Egypt's greatest kings, Amenhotep III. Soon after, he changed his name to Akhenaten, but this was just a hint of the storm he was about to unleash. In a series of sweeping moves, Akhenaten banned the worship of all traditional deities. He replaced them with what he claimed was the one true god, Aten, the disk of the sun. Some consider Akhenaten the creator of monotheism as we know it today, the precursor of Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. Others view Akhenaten's one god as a refinement of existing Egyptian belief.
Akhenaten grew up in a world where Amun, the idea of a single god, was one explanation of reality. So you can't really say that Akhenaten really created that. But what Akhenaten did create was the idea that there is only one valid explanation of reality. In a sense, Akhenaten is not the inventor of monotheism. Akhenaten is the inventor of univalent logic, the idea that only one explanation of reality can be true.
Akhenaten not only denounced the previously established gods, he closed their temples and dismissed their officials. In particular, he singled out the powerful priesthood of the great god Amun.
Akhenaten instituted a form of monotheism, but he also really persecuted the Amun cult above any other traditional cult in Egypt. I mean, much more than the cult of any other Egyptian deity. And people have seen that as an indirect reflection of the fact that the power of the priesthood of Amun had become large enough to disturb the pharaohs.
Surviving inscriptions indicate that Akhenaten instituted a kind of spiritual monopoly. Only the royal family, and most importantly, Akhenaten himself, could be intermediaries with Aten.
Particular political role that he had through his monotheistic suggestions was not lost upon the folks around, because just down the street were the priests of Amun, who had temples and wealth and clout in the government, and they were clearly being pushed aside by Pharaoh Akhenaten, who was saying, if you want to know where power resides, it resides with me.
However, Akhenaten's reign lasted less than 20 years, not long enough to wipe out the traditional belief in Amun, nor fully suppress his priesthood. The pharaohs who ruled after Akhenaten restored Amun and the ancient gods, while systematically dismantling Akhenaten's temples. The heretic king was nearly wiped from history. However, later pharaohs had learned a lesson about the power of the Amun priesthood.
The kings of the time made sure that the cult of Ptah at Memphis achieved equal importance and wealth, and the cult of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis did also. They certainly restored the Amun cult, but they kind of balanced its potential power by paying equal attention to the other two major temples of Egypt.
Egypt's ancient religion had survived its first great challenge. The traditional pantheon of gods would reign supreme for another 1,000 years before they were tested again. It was in 332 BC that Alexander the Great stormed into Egypt, extending his dominion from Macedonia to the land of the pharaohs. But this young conqueror desired more than plunder. He envisioned the diverse people in his empire sharing language, commerce, and religion. This interconnected realm would eventually be recognized as the Greco-Roman world.
Alexander the Great was perhaps the first person that we know of that had this kind of vision of the world as being one, the world as being oikumene, the entire inhabited earth. And finally, those are the values that are picked up also by the Romans later on.
After Alexander's death, his top generals divided up the empire. Ptolemy I grabbed Egypt and ruled from the new capital of Alexandria. His dynasty, the Ptolemies, would last nearly 300 years until the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BC.
The Ptolemies continued many of the building programs. They emulated much of the art. They maintained the hieroglyphs. There was a real effort during that time into the Roman period to maintain the heritage of ancient Egypt.
The Greco-Roman conquerors also maintained Egypt's pantheon of ancient gods. This was shrewd politics. Preserving Egyptian traditions was a way of retaining control. A prime example of such continuity is this temple at Dendera. Though started by the Ptolemies and completed by the Roman emperors Tiberius, Domitian, and Trajan, it served as a cult center for Hathor, a purely Egyptian fertility goddess. Another example was the venerable Egyptian god Horus. The Ptolemies revered him as a cherubic agricultural fertility god, Harpocrates. During the Roman era, Horus was again the falcon-headed deity, but often he was shown wearing armor. In one depiction, Horus was presented as a Roman warrior, defeating chaos, in the form of a crocodile, by piercing it with a spear. But of all the Egyptian deities, Isis was the most revered by Greco-Roman rulers. They built several cult temples for the goddess, most notably at Philae in the south of Egypt. The Isis cult soon spread through the Mediterranean world. It even reached as far as modern-day England, Germany, and Russia, though Isis was depicted in Greco-Roman rather than Egyptian fashions. The Roman emperors eventually viewed this widespread acceptance as a threat to their own power, and they took steps to limit pharaonic religion. Official edicts placed all Egyptian temples under the control of a single Roman official.
They also made the temples completely dependent on the Roman Empire for sustenance, for their own funding. So that when, in the 3rd century, the Roman Empire itself began to suffer from economic catastrophe, the temples too went under.
Despite such adversity, Egypt's ancient beliefs persisted, and in some places thrived. However, their severest threat was already emerging, a new monotheistic faith that was taking root in the Greco-Roman world. But unlike the heresy of Akhenaten, this movement would spell ultimate doom for the gods and goddesses of the pharaohs. "2,000 years ago, Egypt and most of the Western world was ruled from Rome. Greco-Roman culture dominated an estimated 100 million people. But early in the 1st century, Jesus of Nazareth began his ministry. After Jesus was crucified, his followers fanned out across the empire, sowing the seeds for a total transformation of the Greco-Roman world. Church tradition credits St. Mark with bringing Christianity to Egypt during the 1st century. The religion of the pharaohs, then some 3,000 years old, had been weakened but not destroyed by the heavy hand of Rome. Slowly, Christianity spread. Some 400 years would pass before this new faith was accepted throughout Egypt. It would eventually become known as the Coptic Church, Egypt's native brand of Christianity.
There are many parallels between Egyptian religion and Christian teaching. Now, we don't know whether this is just because human beings have a certain similarity with each other, or whether there were actual influences, which there may well have been. There are ancient stories about the god Osiris who died and was dismembered and then brought back to life. And the story of Jesus tells, of course, the story of a man who's executed and tortured and then brought back to life. In the minds of Egyptian Christians, there would have surely been parallels.
Likewise, the Holy Trinity of the Coptic Church, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, echoed the central trio of Egyptian gods: Osiris the Father, Horus the Son, and Isis, the Mother Goddess.
The Egyptians believed in the Trinity, in a flesh Trinity, which was basically a father and a mother and a son. And that's why we know when St. Mark spoke about the Holy Trinity, the Egyptians didn't have a major problem in accepting the Holy Trinity as 3 in 1.
Some of the most striking similarities can be found in religious icons, such as Isis, the Mother Goddess, and her son, Horus.
In the Christian church, we have the Christ child who sits on the lap of his mother, the Virgin Mary. And there are many of us who maintain that the Christ child on the lap of the Virgin Mary is the visual appropriation by the Christians of this very venerable icon of ancient Egypt.
The pronounced resemblance may reflect a political challenge that faced the early Christian church: to wean potential converts from their reverence for Isis.
Isis was really the supreme savior goddess of the ancient Mediterranean world and had her cult as far as York and England. And probably early Christianity found Isis to be one of the most difficult obstacles to the popularity of Christianity because people were devoted to this loving mother goddess.
Another pharaonic theme that continues into Christian times is the armed and mounted Horus. Just as this ancient god battled the forces of chaos, St. George and other so-called rider saints battled the forces of Satan, symbolized by a dragon. Today's Coptic Church views such parallels as part of a larger divine plan.
God has inspired, definitely, the pharaohs to come up with all these concepts that are very close to the Christian life.
However such parallels are explained, the Christianity that emerged in Egypt had its own distinct identity. Its early teachings had remained something of a mystery until the discovery in 1945 of mystical Christian texts, buried for more than 1,000 years. Named for the Egyptian town near which it was unearthed, this collection of some 50 works is known as the Nag Hammadi Library.
What the Nag Hammadi discovery shows is that the early Christian movement was enormously more interesting and complicated than we ever imagined. It shows us that instead of 4 Gospels, which we have in the New Testament, there were dozens, and it shows us what they said and that they're really quite different.
Mary Magdalene was depicted in the New Testament as a devoted but timid follower of Jesus. The Nag Hammadi Library paints a new, though not universally accepted, portrait of Mary as a trusted and outspoken confidant of Jesus.
Here she's one of his closest disciples and one to whom he entrusted special teaching. Peter tells Mary that she can't possibly have heard things like this from the Lord because he would never tell them to a woman. And she objects, speaks against Peter, and is defended by the other disciples.
In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is portrayed as a teacher of Gnosticism, a type of Christianity that views self-knowledge as the way to find God. In this Gospel, Jesus speaks in an extraordinary, mystical style.
One of the striking sayings from the Gospel of Thomas, very different from the New Testament, is saying number 70. Jesus says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you."
Texts like the Gospel of Thomas encourage one to have direct access to the divine. You don't have to go through the local priest or bishop. You can find the God that is within. Certainly, this is a threat to all of those people that are the leaders of the church, that are looking for obedience and looking for followers, as a matter of fact.
Athanasius, the head of Egypt's Christian church in the 4th century, was a powerful opponent of these books, which had circulated during the first few hundred years of Christianity. Athanasius proposed his own list of acceptable texts, and the books found in the Bible today are those he suggested in Egypt 1,700 years ago. Not long after that, the Isis temple at Philae, the last outpost of pharaonic religion, was closed down by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Egypt finally belonged to the Coptic Church. But in little more than a century, a new faith would sweep in from the east, another religion that would find fertile ground along the Nile. As the birthplace of two major faiths, Egypt can rightly be called a cradle of religions. Yet this ancient land has nourished still other faiths, beliefs that originated outside of Egypt. The first of these was Judaism, the earliest of the modern monotheistic religions. In the Old Testament, which is largely the myth and history of the Jewish people, Egypt plays a pivotal role. In fact, it is mentioned more than 600 times. The most important reference may be the Exodus, the epic departure of Moses and the Israelites from Egypt. However, Egypt's picturesque ruins have been stingy in providing proof of the biblical account.
Scholars are, of course, divided on it. Some scholars push for it being almost totally historical, and other scholars for it being almost totally unhistorical. And that depends on their philosophical background as much as on the evidence, because they're reading the same evidence.
Most efforts to find traces of the Israelites have focused on the eastern Nile Delta. Semitic peoples from the land of Canaan were known to have settled in this fertile area during ancient times. Canaanite pharaohs actually ruled part of Egypt beginning around 1650 BC. They were called Hyksos, which means rulers from foreign lands. After a relatively short reign of about 100 years, the Hyksos kings were expelled. However, some of the Semitic settlers remained in the delta. Evidence suggests they were enslaved by later pharaohs.
We have indications that Ramses II used such people in brick-making activities, and we know that they had quotas they had to fulfill.
And the activity of Ramses II as a constructor fits in very nicely with the opening lines of Exodus, because there we hear about the children of Israel being forced to build the treasure cities of Pithom and Pyrameses. And Pyrameses is the domain of Ramses.
Ramses II has long been the prime suspect as the pharaoh of Exodus. One of the few tangible clues in the mystery is supplied by his son and his successor, Merneptah. This freestanding relief is known as the Merneptah Stela. In its text, the nation of Israel is mentioned for the first time outside of the Bible. Merneptah describes the Israelites as living in Canaan, perhaps where they settled after the Exodus.
So we have now the reign of Merneptah with Israel as an established political entity. And then archaeologists start to extrapolate backward from that to try to get other events that then might fit. And depending on how you want to read the evidence, Ramses II becomes the pharaoh of the Exodus.
Whether or not the biblical account of Exodus can be historically verified, its symbolic meaning is still relevant today.
When we're speaking about the Exodus out of Egypt, we're actually speaking about the removal of the bondage that the physical world has on a person on a daily basis. That is actually the significance of moving from a place called slavery into a place called freedom.
The list of religions with ties to Egypt does not end with Judaism. Islam, newest of the world's major monotheistic faiths, also found its way to this ancient land. Egypt was part of the Byzantine Empire at the time Islam originated in Arabia around the year 610. The Prophet Muhammad first preached his new faith in the city of Mecca, then later in Medina. The Word of God, as revealed to Muhammad, was compiled into Islam's sacred book, the Quran. This text reflects Jewish and Christian traditions, recognizing Moses, Jesus, and others as prophets who set the stage for Muhammad.
Islam considers itself to be a continuation of the religion brought in by Abraham, continuing through Judaism, Christianity, and then ending by Islam. So it takes basically all the rest within its principles.
The Quran incorporates the Ten Commandments and enforces a strict ban on religious imagery, a ban that extends to depictions of Muhammad himself.
What about Muhammad? Why is he not drawn? Because there was a possibility that people might start worshipping him as an idol, may replace God with him. So very strongly it was emphasized that there is no idol worshipping and no pictures and no drawings of the Prophet. That's why you will find that in majority of the Islamic mosques, pictures are not there.
In 634 AD, Islamic armies marched out of Arabia and in less than 100 years had overrun much of the Greco-Roman world, including Egypt. Muslim tactics were relatively humane, considering that ruthless era. Islamic troops would approach a city and offer its citizens the option of surrender. If the city chose to fight and then lost, it would forfeit its wealth and religious shrines. A city that gave up could keep its treasures and simply share its sacred space with the conquering Muslims.
Sometimes when these cities had capitulated, the Muslims would use synagogues or churches as mosques, as their space for the ritual prayer, along with the Christian or Jewish communities. Only in cases when fighting had ensued, then Muslims were allowed to take booty and also to take over the ritual spaces of respective communities.
Egypt was conquered in 642 AD. Within some 200 years, it would be transformed from a Greek-speaking Christian land to one of Muslims speaking Arabic. And Islam's house of worship, the mosque, would take its place among Egypt's churches, synagogues, and ancient pharaonic temples. Cairo eventually became known as the City of 1,000 Minarets, a reference to the tower-like structures from which Muslims are called to prayer. Inside the mosque, verses from the Quran decorate the walls. To the casual observer, these inscriptions might seem equivalent to the hieroglyphs in pharaonic temples. However, Islam is unrelated to Egypt's ancient religion. The use of Quranic verse brought sanctity to the mosque without violating Muhammad's ban on religious portraits. In Egypt and other Islamic countries, one wall of the mosque features an arched recess known as the mihrab. It indicates the direction of the city of Mecca, which all Muslims must face while praying. In Mecca, the focus of their devotion is this windowless stone structure known as the Kaaba. While it is Islam's holiest site, the Kaaba is said to have been built by Abraham, the Old Testament Hebrew patriarch.
The structure of the Kaaba, which means cube, is a very basic geometrical form, and that it has a religious it's a religious symbol rather than an architectural one, and has been actually rebuilt several times throughout Islam.
Facing Mecca is the sole requirement for Islamic prayer. Even a mosque is not mandatory. However, the mosque does promote social equality, one of the principal tenets of Islam.
God is not confined in the four walls of the mosque. But when we use the mosque as a structure, what basically we're saying is that this is a place where people are safe to walk in and to be recognized as equal without any caste and class differences.
Though Egypt is undeniably an Islamic country today, its layers of religious history do produce unique hybrids. Perhaps the best example involves this mosque, planted squarely in the Pharaonic temple at Luxor. Inside lies the tomb of an Islamic holy man named Abu el-Haggag. Every year, thousands of Muslims gather to celebrate his memory with a boisterous procession. The origins of this ritual are not Islamic. They reach back thousands of years to Pharaonic Egypt.
In the Opet festival, as in many other festivals, the statue of the god was placed on a boat and was carried on the shoulders of priests. It would be carried around the temple, outside of the temple, it would be taken on processions. In the modern festival of Abu Haggag, which is still celebrated every year in Luxor, boats are placed on the shoulders of men and are paraded around the temple. But it very clearly is related to the ancient Pharaonic Opet festival.
Perhaps it is fitting that in Egypt, home to so many gods over so many centuries, the lines separating different religions are blurred. In some respects, the diverse beliefs that took root here are roads to the same destination, the place where individuals can satisfy the need to touch the divine.
Those who visit Egypt to see its holy places sometimes have to look below street level. Over the centuries, the annual inundations of the Nile River deposited sediment as much as 2 stories high, so that in places, Islamic Egypt was built directly over the ancient land of the pharaohs.
5,000 years, a stretch of time few can hope to comprehend. 5,000 years. It might just as well be forever. Yet no less a span is needed to encompass the legacy of Egypt's religions, the many faiths that built heavenward in tribute to their different gods. During this long march of centuries, Egyptian Muslims constructed their mosques and minarets, and Jews their synagogues. Egypt's Coptic Christians raised up churches and monasteries. But before them all, pharaohs honored their many gods with a myriad of temples and monuments. These varied faiths often built their shrines on the very same hallowed ground, and even used their predecessors' temples as their own.
It's probably not a coincidence that some of the Pharaonic temples were later used as churches and as mosques. We can see this even in the Pharaonic period, where once an area was sacred, it was considered to have very special sanctity. And so even in the ancient period, a temple would be demolished and a new temple would be built on top of it, because the idea that the site itself was special.
Stone blocks from the earlier demolished temples were often reused in later structures. This temple gateway may seem to be built of custom quarried stone, but the backside shows that the blocks were part of older structures. Such continual renovation has left a veil of mystery over Egypt's Old Kingdom temples, which were built more than 4,000 years ago. Few have been found intact. However, surviving ruins suggest that temples to the sun god, Re, were of central importance during the early stages of Egyptian religion.
The sun temples is something that we really know of only from the Old Kingdom, from the Age of the Pyramids, and in fact specifically from the 5th dynasty. I think it's fair to say that we don't really quite understand why this is done at this particular time, because it doesn't happen earlier and it isn't repeated later.
Little remains from these immense sun temples. This one, built by the pharaoh Niuserre around 2400 BC, is the best preserved. The dominant feature was a massive pedestal that supported an obelisk more than 100 feet tall. All told, this colossal monument towered 18 stories above the desert. It is among the earliest examples of an obelisk, majestic symbol of the sun.
These are not minor chapels. These are major monuments, which are also supplied with a kind of gigantic model of the solar boat that the sun god uses to travel through the sky. They actually built one of brick and wood next to the sun temple.
Though sun temples were built during only a relatively short time, the obelisk became an enduring solar icon. For more than 1,000 years, well into the New Kingdom, pharaohs continued to honor the god Re by placing obelisks in their temples. Originally, many were tipped with gold. These New Kingdom rulers, who began their reign about 1550 BC, adopted a relatively uniform temple plan. It had an entryway known as a pylon, a sunlit public courtyard, a roofed, shaded area with rows of columns called the hypostyle hall, and finally, a dimly lit inner sanctum. The massive front pylon gateway was the signature element of New Kingdom temples. Like the obelisk, the pylon was a solar symbol, a gigantic stylized hieroglyph that meant horizon. In addition, scenes carved on the pylons defined sacred space as a stronghold of Ma'at, of order in the cosmos.
The temples themselves have images of the pharaoh dominating and killing foreigners depicted on the outside. That's a literal representation of the fact that outside the sacred is the chaotic and the dangerous.
Beyond the pylon lay the courtyard, the only area with unrestricted entry for the public. On certain ceremonial occasions, people might be allowed into the hypostyle hall. However, ordinary Egyptians were banned from the inner chambers of the temple.
Temples were like mansions of great, powerful human beings. The god lived inside the temple, not accessible to most people, just as you can't go into the White House and say hello to the president whenever you feel like it. So you couldn't go into the depths of the temple to greet the god whenever you felt like it.
A statue of the temple god was kept in a tiny, dark shrine deep within the complex. Though it was the most important place in the temple, this inner sanctum was purposely small, in keeping with an underlying symbolic design.
One of the basic notions that shapes the decoration and the architecture of any Egyptian temple is the idea that the temple represents the coming into being of the cosmos.
This symbolic creation began with the temple god in the darkness of the sanctuary, just as the mythic creation began with the god Atum in the darkness of the primordial waters. The columns in the hypostyle hall represent plants that sprouted at the dawn of creation. The symbolism continues through the rest of the temple.
You move through a series of halls and rooms which get bigger and higher and wider and larger until you come out into the great courtyard, which is enormous with the great pylon in front of it. And that is to convey the idea of growth. Growth from something very small, which is the way the Creator begins, and then the growth of the cosmos that the Creator initiates.
It's interesting because it's very much like the modern theory of the Big Bang. In the Egyptian concept, all the matter in the universe came from an original single point of matter, a singularity, which at some point, which had existed from all time, unchanged, but at some point kind of exploded, expanded into all the things that are in the world that we can see.
By incorporating this creation imagery, all New Kingdom temples were unified in a potent display of religious belief. Yet not all temples were of equal status. One loomed above the rest, the temple of Amun, mighty god of empire. Egypt had reinvented itself in the New Kingdom. Prior to this era, around 1650 BC, the north of Egypt was ruled by foreign kings known as Hyksos. But warrior princes from Thebes in the south expelled the Hyksos, then led their armies in conquest of surrounding lands. By 1550, the Theban princes had become pharaohs over all of Egypt, a mighty empire that feasted on tribute from defeated nations. As their fortunes rose, these pharaohs elevated their local deity, Amun, into a god of national importance.
As time went on, he became syncretized or amalgamated with other deities, the most important one of which was the solar god Re. So in this amalgamated form, he was called Amun-Re and then became the king of the gods. So from a fairly unimportant local deity, he then became the most important god in ancient Egypt for many, many centuries.
No god shined brighter than Amun. His temple at Karnak is testimony to this exalted status. More than 2,000 years in the making, Karnak is a wondrous maze of pylons, obelisks, and pillared halls, ranging over some 250 acres. It is the largest religious complex on the face of the planet.
Most pharaohs wanted to make some significant addition to Karnak because they thought that would reinforce their good standing with the god Amun-Ra, who's such a major god of the period. And some kings, of course, built on a very large scale at Karnak. Others built chapels or colonnades or dedicated statues and things of this kind. So they contributed to Karnak in a variety of ways.
In keeping with the New Kingdom plan, an immense public courtyard opens up just beyond Karnak's front pylon. The courtyard, in turn, leads to a hypostyle hall. But the forest of columns at Karnak dwarfs any pillared hall ever built, before or since. All told, the hall contains more than 130 pillars. The central columns rise 7 stories above the floor. Such imposing grandeur was made possible by the discovery of huge sandstone deposits. Old and Middle Kingdom builders had been limited to the less versatile limestone.
You can quarry much larger pieces of sandstone than you can limestone, and it has the property of being able to span much, much greater distances than limestone. And so you suddenly end up with these huge hypostyle halls and these huge columns.
It was calculated that the bigger columns in this hall, about 20 or 30 people, could sit on the top around a table and have a banquet. They're so enormous.
But even at Karnak, the statue of the temple god was kept in a small chamber. Here, priests would perform rituals to placate Amun. They hoped to enlist his help with national concerns, such as assuring that the pharaoh stayed strong, Egypt's enemies remained weak, and the Nile brought a bountiful harvest. Another temple devoted to large-scale state concerns was this one, at Abu Simbel in Nubia, just beyond Egypt's southern border. It was built by the great pharaoh Ramses II. The statues of Ramses that guard the entryway loom some 7 stories high and were actually carved out of a mountain. A large hallway lined with still more statues was cut some 200 feet into the rock. In the innermost sanctuary, the deified Ramses sits in the company of the gods Amun, Ptah, and Re. However, there was more than theology at work at Abu Simbel.
We know it was built in that area as essentially a piece of political propaganda. During the period, although Egypt dominated the Nubians to the south, there was constant stress between the two, and the Egyptians really wanted to dominate, in particular, the Nubian economy. So by building a temple of this scale, in this grandeur, very far in Nubia, it was like a big signpost to the Nubians saying, don't mess with us, don't come further north, because look what we can do.
Unlike the pharaohs, ordinary Egyptians were often more concerned about personal matters, such as health, crops, romance, or pregnancy. These issues could be addressed at the shrines of lesser gods. The best known of such temples was built by the female pharaoh Hatshepsut for the goddess Hathor.
Hathor was related to sex and fertility, and if a person wanted to find a future husband, or if a woman who was married wanted to have children and hadn't yet, she would go to a Hathoric shrine and leave cakes or leave a little votive of some type for the goddess Hathor, because the goddess Hathor was interested in helping people's fertility and was patroness of marriage.
Large or small, temples were the heart of Egyptian religion, the setting for rituals that continued over thousands of years. Only one pharaoh ever dared to interrupt this tradition, the enigmatic religious rebel Akhenaten. The temple design first introduced by New Kingdom pharaohs remained in use for an astonishing 15 centuries. Still, there were some deviations from the standard plan. Most notable were the temples built by the pharaoh Akhenaten after he imposed his brand of monotheism on Egypt around 1350 BC. Like his theology of the one true God, Akhenaten's temple design reversed time-honored convention. Though none have survived, these structures can be imagined from inscriptions and excavated foundations. The entry was in the darkness of a hypostyle hall. Then the temple's most sacred space opened up under sunlit sky. It was the exact opposite of the established New Kingdom plan for a sunlit courtyard leading to a dark inner shrine.
Akhenaten's god is light, the power of light which comes into the world through the sun. Light can't get in to a closed room. So, in order to worship light, you need an open space. That's why Akhenaten's temples are open and airy. This is also why in his reliefs you see such a celebration of nature. It's what you can see. It's the reality that's made knowable to people by light.
Akhenaten's renegade monotheism was a failure, and his temples were destroyed soon after his death. But in time, Egypt would also become linked to the temples of history's first successful monotheistic religion, Judaism. According to the Old Testament, it was during the Israelites' exodus from Egypt that the prototype for a Jewish temple first took shape.
The Israelites, before leaving Egypt, did have houses of study, but did not have formal houses of worship. So the actual house of worship that started this idea called synagogue was this temporary structure called the tabernacle that was constructed during their travel out of Egypt.
This first tabernacle was fashioned from linen curtains and animal skins, mounted on acacia wood frames. It had a courtyard and inner sanctum, elements that had also been part of pharaonic temples. These features would reappear in Judaism's holiest site, the famous temple built by King Solomon in Jerusalem. Eventually, Jewish temples were built in Egypt itself. The Ben Ezra Synagogue stands in the oldest section of Cairo, where it has been a quiet refuge of Judaism for more than 1,000 years. Just outside the synagogue is a covered well. According to ancient legend, it is the heart of the biblical link between Egypt and Judaism, the very spot where Pharaoh's daughter found Moses among the bulrushes. The book of Exodus reports that Moses was then raised in the Egyptian royal court. It was this mythic twist of fate that allowed Moses to escape the drowning of Israelite baby boys ordered by the Pharaoh, and to one day lead his people to the promised land. the convergence of Jewish and Pharaonic traditions continued into modern times. Cairo's Shah Hashemayim synagogue was built in the early 1900s. Though it is Jewish sacred space, this synagogue is decorated with the same symbol, solar disk with royal cobras, used by the pharaohs more than 3,000 years ago. Shah Hashemayim illustrates the far-reaching influence of Pharaonic tradition, beliefs so potent in ancient times they even swayed Egypt's conquerors. One outstanding example is this temple at Edfu in southern Egypt. While it looks Egyptian and was dedicated to the Egyptian god Horus, it was built by the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that ruled Egypt beginning around 300 BC. During their reign, the Ptolemy kings not only honored the Egyptian gods, they depicted themselves as pharaohs and spelled out their names in hieroglyphs on temple walls and columns. Roman emperors continued these traditions after they snatched Egypt from the Ptolemies in 30 BC.
When the Roman emperors ruled Egypt, they were quite conscientious about continuing to support traditional religion. And so in temples all over Egypt, you get Roman emperors depicted in purely traditional Egyptian style, as if they were pharaohs.
Although these temples were primarily Egyptian in style, a few telltale designs do reveal the foreign Greco-Roman influence. This ceiling, from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, is decorated with both Pharaonic deities, like the hippo-shaped goddess Taweret, and Greco-Roman zodiac figures, such as Scorpio and Taurus. The mix of ancient Egyptian and Greco-Roman traditions can also be seen in this temple at Esna, dedicated to Khnum, the ram-headed god of the Nile. Inside, the walls and columns are inscribed with traditional offering scenes. Here, however, the gift being offered to the god is a laurel wreath, prized in the Greco-Roman world, but unheard of in Pharaonic Egypt. Though these temples were built by Greco-Roman rulers, the priests were Egyptian. They were able to meet the religious needs of the local populace while attracting the spiritually curious from across the Greco-Roman world.
The priests had a sense of a new market, not just the local environment, not just people concerned with fertility and people concerned with health, but also Roman youths concerned with gaining some kind of religious experience. Roman youths had an exotic sense of what it might mean to travel up the Nile, to meet with a genuine Egyptian guru and learn the true facts of the true religion, the true God. And Egypt really becomes the way India did in the 60s.
Eventually, the fame of Egypt's sacred places brought unwelcome scrutiny from Rome. Temples that offered oracles, like the cult of the fertility god Bes at Abydos, were seen as political threats by some emperors.
In 199 AD, Septimius Severus issued a decree against Egyptian oracles, claiming these to be a form of superstition. This drove the practice of consulting images of the gods for oracular purposes underground.
The edicts from the beginning of the Roman Empire through the Christian period became increasingly constricting on Egyptian building, Egyptian temples, on the maintenance of the infrastructure of Egyptian religion.
Starved for resources and choked by foreign rulers, Egypt's temples were unable to serve the people. After some 3,000 years, time was finally running out for Pharaonic religion. This ancient land would soon give birth to a new form of sacred space, the monasteries of the Coptic Church, Egypt's native brand of Christianity. At the dawn of Christianity, the religion of Egypt's pharaohs was already 3,000 years old. Egyptian temples had been the very heart of these ancient beliefs, and it was here that the early Christians first staked their claim as Egypt's new faith.
Because these temples were so important in the environment, it was natural that Christians would establish their first chapels within the temple confines. There were numerous ways in which people would do this. One would be to incise a cross right onto the pillar. And that way you have essentially carved out for yourself a Christian space. You've neutralized it, you've sanctified it within the temple environment.
Besides converting pharaonic temples to their own use, Egypt's early Christians also established churches based on New Testament tradition, most notably an account in the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus himself had spent time in Egypt. Matthew recounts the birth of Jesus during the reign of King Herod in Judea. Herod perceived this newly born king of the Jews as a rival and ordered his soldiers to murder every male Jewish child. However, Matthew reports that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph managed to slip away to Egypt.
The Coptic tradition tells us that the Holy Family visited Egypt and stayed there about 3 years and a half. Most of the places that they visited now, we have either monasteries or churches, and some of them are used as pilgrimage for the believers to go and visit.
Within the maze of ancient walkways that comprises Coptic Cairo can be found the best known of these sites, the Church of St. Sergius. Beyond its remarkably plain facade, St. Sergius boasts the graceful interior space that was in vogue 15 centuries ago when the church was built. Though the Church of St. Sergius is named for an early Christian martyr, its most famous feature is a subterranean chapel. 2,000 years ago, it was a crypt in the Jewish quarter of Old Cairo. Many believe that the Holy Family took refuge in this very place. However, this sacred site lies some 30 feet below street level, and water from the Nile River seeps in. The chapel has been flooded ever since the Aswan High Dam was completed in 1970. Traditional Coptic accounts say that the Holy Family's escape from Herod led them to journey down the Nile, deep into southern Egypt. This church at Ma'adi, overlooking the Nile near Cairo, marks the place where they supposedly set sail. According to legend, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph descended these steps to the river's edge.
To the present day, the Coptic Church celebrates the coming of the Holy Family to Egypt. It is, after all, one of the ways in which the legitimacy and the central significance of the Coptic Church is secured.
The Gospel of Matthew reports that the Holy Family left Egypt and returned to Palestine after King Herod's death. But this account is more than a tale of survival. It serves to equate Jesus with Moses. To begin with, Jesus escaped Herod's slaughter of baby Jewish boys. This is viewed as a direct parallel to the infant Moses escaping Pharaoh's slaughter of baby Israelite boys. In addition, Jesus and Moses each emerged from Egypt to become a spiritual leader of his people.
The story in Matthew of the Holy Family coming out of Egypt is very reminiscent of the story of Moses and the Exodus. And this then becomes the Exodus of Jesus out of Egypt and into the Promised Land.
And he's also, like Moses, going to bring a new Torah, a new law to his people. And so Matthew will picture Jesus as the new and better Moses.
Coptic Christianity's roots in the land of Egypt can also be detected in the sound of its religious rites. The service is conducted in Coptic, a language spoken in Egypt well over 2,000 years ago. Once used to praise Amun, Isis and other deities, Coptic is now heard only in churches, where it provides a direct link to Egypt's pharaonic past. One other link is equally dramatic. Just as ancient Egyptians saw the desert as the domain of Seth, god of chaos, early Egyptian Christians viewed the desert as an outpost of Satan. This threat would inspire a new kind of Christian sacred space, the monastery. Beginning in the 3rd century, a few bold Christian monks ventured into the desert to engage in hand-to-hand combat with evil.
They went out as the shock troops of God out into the desert. They went out there and they battled the animals and the demons and the devil out there in order to advance the cause of God. The concept of going out to face the demons in the desert is very compatible with Egypt in general, because the desert, after all, is the land of Set in pharaonic Egypt.
Among the first Christian monks to challenge this ancient land of Set was Saint Anthony. Born into a wealthy family, Anthony gave away his fortune and around 270 AD adopted a life of solitude in Egypt's vast eastern desert. For several years, he lived alone in this mountaintop cave. Eventually, Anthony's reputation for piety began to spread, and disciples gathered in the wilderness below.
The life in the desert, it is a way to help the monk to be alone, just to be away from people, to feel that he is alone with God, to feel that he is free with God.
Saint Anthony and his followers built this small church in the mid-4th century. It is among Egypt's oldest Christian sites. After his death in 365 AD, Saint Anthony was buried inside the structure. Within a few years, Saint Anthony's supporters established Christianity's first monastery, a secluded community dedicated to religious pursuits. The original church was its spiritual center.
The monastery at the time in the 4th century was just the church, and all the monks are living in caves in the mountain. So there is no wall at that time for the monastery. They are living just as hermits in caves, and they have to come to the church every week for the prayer and for the Holy Communion.
Over the centuries, living quarters, gardens, and additional churches were built within a walled compound. A spring inside the walls is the sole source of water for the monastery. It is the same spring that sustained Saint Anthony during his sojourn in the wilderness 1,600 years ago. And during those 16 centuries, the ideas Saint Anthony pioneered in the Egyptian desert have found wide acceptance.
Monastic life was exported from Egypt to Europe, and any monk of any sort in the world has a trace of Saint Anthony, who is the Egyptian believer and the Egyptian monk who started monasticism in the whole world.
By the 6th century, Coptic Christianity was fully established. Its churches had displaced pharaonic temples of the past, and its monasticism was shaping Christianity of the future. However, the words of the Prophet Muhammad would soon ring out across Egypt. Once again, ritual space in this ancient land would assume a new shape. 5 times each day, Muslims in Egypt and around the world are summoned to prayer. This call has been heard in Cairo since Islam swept into Egypt around 640 AD. In the centuries that followed, mosques and minarets took their place in the Egyptian landscape. However, Islam's ritual structures play a different role than those of the pharaohs, the Christians, or the Jews. Islam alone dictates no formal distinction between sacred and secular space.
Muslims do not need any built environment to perform the ritual prayer. There is one saying of the Prophet Muhammad, Kulul ard masjid ila makbara wal hamam, which means the whole earth is a mosque.
The mosque is not actually sacred space at all. Rather, it is a public resource for the benefit of the Muslim community. This ideal can be traced to Islam's first mosque, the Prophet Muhammad's house in the Arabian town of Medina. The residence itself was a string of small rooms outside a mud brick enclosure wall. More important was the courtyard within, the heart of Islam's first community.
Very simple, but this basic structure in which the Islamic community assembled for prayer, where they also listened to the Prophet Muhammad's sermons, would, for the time to come, form the basic matrix of mosques in the Islamic world.
One wall was shaded by an awning of mud-plastered palm fronds. This marked the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, which all Muslims must face when praying. In the 14 centuries since Muhammad's time, Islamic architects built on this basic plan. In many cases, the shaded Qibla wall became a fully enclosed sanctuary. Typically, arches and columns punctuate the space. The floor was usually carpeted, without chairs or pews.
The ritual prayer of a Muslim involves a sequence of movements, standing, bowing, kneeling, and finally prostration in front of God. Everybody also has to stand in line, in long lines, to watch the movements of the imam, the one who leads the prayer.
The largest mosques, such as Al-Azhar in Cairo, were designed to accommodate entire communities. Known as congregational mosques, they feature a vast central courtyard linked to an enclosed sanctuary. To the casual observer, the arrangement of courtyard and sanctuary might seem to suggest pharaonic influence. However, Islamic traditions are not rooted in ancient Egypt. Unlike pharaonic temples, where public access was limited, the mosque is open to everyone.
From the earliest time on, mosques were used not only as a place where the community would gather for prayer or sermons, but also to decide community matters, even to store weaponry, to store treasures, where people would be taught in the basics of Islamic law, for instance. Many major Islamic universities started out in the congregational mosques of a city.
Al-Azhar exemplifies these varied uses. Founded in the year 970 as a school of Islamic theology, Al-Azhar is the world's oldest university. Today, it is the foremost center of Islamic teaching. As it has for more than 1,000 years, Al-Azhar also functions as a ritual space. Friday afternoon prayer is the most important service of the week, and here, attendance is measured in the thousands. Integral to the Friday prayer is a program of religious instruction known as khutbah.
This khutbah is divided into its two parts. Before the prayer is one, which most people attend, and after the prayer it's a form of religious lecture.
Sometimes the featured instructor is the Sheikh Al-Azhar, the mosque's senior theologian. He is one of Islam's most respected figures, and his comments are broadcast across Egypt. Long before the days of television, Muslims called the faithful to prayer from tower-like structures known as minarets. While they may be the most recognizable symbol of Islam, minarets are not required features of its ritual space.
Minarets appear as part of mosques as soon as these buildings are erected in a non-Muslim environment. That is, for instance, larger Christian cities. Minarets, high towers, were visual markers of the Muslim presence in a city, also as a symbol of power of Islam in those regions.
Egypt's first Muslim rulers, like the Greeks and Romans before them, were not native to the country. The influence of these foreigners is evident in some of Cairo's early minarets. This one was built in the 9th century by a ruler from Iraq named Ahmed ibn Tulun.
Its form comes from the city of Samarra in Iraq, and Ahmed ibn Tulun was sent here as a military governor from Iraq. The minaret is quite unique in Cairo with its external spiral staircase, which is also a feature that you find in Samarra, only there the spiral was from the bottom all the way to the top. Here it's about halfway.
Subsequent rulers adopted their own minaret styles. Like the pharaohs who tried to build ever larger pyramids, Egypt's Islamic leaders outdid each other in raising ever taller minarets.
Some of the minarets that were built between the 13th and the 16th century in Cairo were so high that it would be almost impossible for a normal person who went through the streets to hear the call for prayer.
Balconies at lower levels of these soaring minarets allowed the prayer call to be heard in Cairo's bustling streets. This minaret stands far from the busy hum of Cairo. In fact, it can be found within the confines of the 6th century Christian monastery of St. Catherine, located deep in Egypt's Sinai desert. St. Catherine's marks a convergence of religious traditions that would be unbelievable in any place but Egypt. It is situated near a rugged peak, identified by age-old legend as the biblical Mount Sinai. Here, Moses is said to have received the 10 Commandments from the hand of God, while below, the Israelites savored their freedom from the brickyards of Ramses II. At this one site, echoes of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh are layered over with Christian, Islamic, and Jewish belief. No other place on earth can match Egypt's many faiths. Though the gods they celebrate are varied and their prayers are offered in different tongues, Egypt's ritual spaces seem to share a common thread. Whether built by pharaoh, priest, or prophet, each attests in its own religious signs that there is in life a higher purpose, no matter that it is called salvation, righteousness, or preserving order in the cosmos.
History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Hello, I'm Peter Woodward. Welcome to the History Channel. Death has often been called the great equalizer. It is a justly earned reputation. In ancient Egypt, the mightiest pharaoh and the most humble fisherman each had to face their own mortality. And so too did Egypt's Muslims, Jews, and Coptic Christians. For 5,000 years, one of the prime concerns of these religions was explaining the mysteries of the hereafter. Join us for Egypt, land of the gods.
How do you solve the greatest mystery of human experience? The ancient Egyptians built majestic tombs and mummified their dead, hoping for rebirth and eternal life.
You're never hungry, you never grow old, you're never sick, you never die.
So the tomb chapel becomes a kind of miniature cosmos all by itself in which the dead person functions.
The religion of the pharaohs vanished long ago, displaced by Judaism, Christianity, and finally Islam. But the central belief that a better life awaits us after death has never changed.
What has happened is that some of the old traditions of Egypt have gone into and found a new meaning in the faith itself.
Death and rebirth along the Nile. Next on Egypt, land of the gods. Nothing in the human experience is more absolute and less avoidable than death. Facing this inevitability inspired some of ancient Egypt's most profound religious beliefs and motivated the construction of its most awesome monuments. At the heart of it all was the promise of rebirth and eternal life after death. It is a concept as old as Egypt itself. 12,000 years ago, long before pyramids and pharaohs, the earliest Egyptians lived in villages along the Nile and buried their dead in the desert beyond. But these primitive graves included more than just a body. Excavations revealed the presence of food, cosmetics, and tools.
Whether the people who were buried were going to use this material themselves, or whether they were going to perhaps give it as a gift to a higher power in the next life, we don't really know the answer to. But they seem to indicate a belief of some sort in an afterlife.
In the primitive graves used by early Egyptians, the hot desert sand naturally dried out the corpse and prevented decay. But the rise of Egypt's first kings, around 2900 BC, brought a demand for more permanent tombs. Soon, the mastaba replaced the simple desert burial pit. Built of brick or stone, the mastaba was a flat-roofed, rectangular tomb. Ritual areas and storage rooms were built above ground, while the body was secured in a subterranean chamber.
As these got more elaborate, they tended to prevent the sun and the sand from drying out the body because they no longer had direct contact with it, and the body was not preserved any longer. So they had to come up with a separate way of mummifying and preserving the dead.
Over time, the Egyptians learned to duplicate the desiccating power of the desert. This shallow lake was a primary source for a salt called natron that was used to dry the corpse and prevent decay. Typically, the process took some 40 days. Then, the preserved body was wrapped in cloth. Egyptians regarded the heart as the seat of knowledge and intelligence. Embalmers left it inside the body. The brain, however, was thought to be of little importance and thus expendable. A special tool facilitated its removal.
They inserted a brain hook in through the nostril into the brain cavity and then twirled it around to sort of reduce the brain to a mush and then pulled it out of the nostril.
The development of mummification was one factor that enabled Egypt's kings to plan ever bigger tombs, like the famous step pyramid of the pharaoh Djoser. It was built around 2600 BC, the first large-scale stone building on the face of the planet. It was soon followed by the first true pyramid, constructed by the pharaoh Snefru. His son, Khufu, built the biggest tomb of all, the Great Pyramid at Giza. Like the primitive desert burials from which they evolved, these majestic tombs contained a preserved body and a supply of grave goods. But instead of simple clay pots, Egypt's pharaohs surrounded themselves with stockpiles of royal wealth, golden artifacts whose value was beyond calculation. As for pyramids themselves, large or small, they served the same purpose. They were engines of rebirth, built to transform the dead king into a spirit blessed with eternal life.
Their concept of the afterlife was the ability to come out of the tomb at dawn and live in the world during the day, and go back into the tomb at night. Paradise was really Egypt itself, the best of all possible worlds, but without the physical discomforts of a body, so that you're never cold, you're never hot, you're never hungry, you never grow old, you're never sick, you never die.
To the Egyptians, the process of rebirth mirrored the workings of an orderly cosmos, most notably the cycle of the sun. Each night, the sun descended into the underworld, or Duat. There the god Osiris delivered a jolt of regenerative power, and the sun was reborn in the morning.
The burial chamber in the tomb, which holds the sarcophagus and the mummy, is the Duat. It's an individual Duat, one for the person who's buried there. The mummy of the person is that person's Osiris, and the spirit has to enter that mummy at night to receive from it the power to come to life again in the morning, and then proceeds from there out of the tomb into the world of the living.
The Egyptians believed that a reborn spirit needed daily sustenance in the form of offerings and prayers from the living. Virtually every pyramid tomb had an adjoining mortuary temple, where these offerings were placed and incantations recited. Such funerary complexes were standard for 1,000 years through the Old and Middle Kingdoms. But the pyramid tomb, with its vast store of wealth, was abandoned with the rise of the New Kingdom around 1550 BC.
Of course, all the earlier pyramidal tombs were always being robbed, and by the time of the New Kingdom, that history of robbery would be well known.
In an attempt to outwit the tomb robbers, New Kingdom pharaohs revamped the funerary complex. Now, the mortuary temple where rituals took place would be separate from the tomb itself. Most royal mortuary temples, like this one built by Ramses III at Medinet Habu, looked like temples for the gods and followed the standard New Kingdom plan of pylon entryway, public courtyard, enclosed hypostyle hall, and inner sanctum for the daily mortuary rituals. The only known variation was the temple built by Hatshepsut, the powerful female pharaoh who assumed the throne around 1470 BC.
The temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahri is set against the foot of these very high, steep cliffs, and it itself is built as if it is a mountainous feature because it rises in a series of terraces rather than being spread out horizontally along the ground like most Egyptian temples were.
These royal mortuary temples were strung out at the edge of the floodplain on the western side of the Nile. To stop the epidemic of tomb robberies, the actual burial sites were hidden away in a rugged desert canyon called the Valley of the Kings. These New Kingdom royal tombs were cut deep into the rock itself. No pyramid or other monument marked their location, nothing to serve as a beacon to would-be robbers. Inside, however, the burial chamber continued the age-old tradition of mirroring the cosmos on an intimate scale.
In tomb chapels, they will represent stars or other celestial symbols on the ceiling, and then you will see scenes that very often relate to the world of the living on the walls. So the tomb chapel becomes a kind of miniature cosmos all by itself in which the dead person functions.
Tombs are also not only a model of the cosmos, but they're also a model of the mechanism of birth. The burial chamber is the womb, and the corridor that leads out of the burial chamber is the passage out of the womb into the world.
However, attaining eternal life required more than a symbolic tomb and a properly mummified body. There would be no afterlife until the spirit of the deceased had faced judgment in the underworld, judgment before the great god Osiris himself. Over the course of some 20 centuries, the kings of ancient Egypt spared no expense in constructing their funerary monuments. Eventually, high-ranking nobles and an elite class of scribes, priests, and other officials also built tombs for themselves. Some of the most widely accepted funerary traditions can be traced back to an Old Kingdom pharaoh named Unas, who died around 2300 BC. Inside the crumbling ruins of his pyramid tomb, the burial chamber walls are dense with hieroglyphs. The texts include magic spells intended to protect and guide the spirit through the underworld. One verse describes the attributes of the Egyptian gods that will be assumed by the pharaoh Unas when he is reborn as a deified spirit.
He will count hearts. He will claim hearts. Whom he wishes to live will live. Whom he wishes to die will die.
Known as pyramid texts, these potent formulas first appeared in this tomb, and for centuries after were available only to royalty.
These pyramid texts become the coffin texts by the Middle Kingdom, where rather than being carved on the walls of royal pyramids, they are now inscribed on the sides of wooden coffins used for the nobility. By the New Kingdom, the coffin texts have evolved into the Book of the Dead, which are inscribed on papyri and placed with the corpse in his tomb. This is a democratization, so that magical spells which had once been restricted only to the highest nobility now expand into the wider range of anyone who can actually afford them.
However, the benefits of eternal life were not granted automatically. Rebirth had to be earned. After death, the deceased faced a time of reckoning, a divine judgment before Osiris, lord of the underworld, and a tribunal of assessor gods. The first test was the negative confession.
This was a series of things that the person not supposed to do in their lifetime, and so they profess before the gods as they're being judged to be reborn, saying, I have not cheated, I have not lied, I was not disobedient to the gods or the king.
I have not stolen, I have not killed anybody, I've not been disrespectful.
And if he is successful in convincing the assessors that he has acted in a socially responsible way, he is deemed true of voice, ma'aheru, which means he didn't lie.
Once you pass through that, then you go to the weighing of the heart. The heart for the ancient Egyptians was the seat of all thought and emotion. So it encapsulates what a person is.
As the deceased looked on, their heart was put on a scale and balanced against a feather, the symbol of Ma'at.
Ma'at is the Egyptian concept of the way things ought to be. And if you've lived a proper life, the two should balance. If that happens, then you're able to pass through the judgment and go on to eternal life.
If, however, the heart did not balance with the feather, it was proof the deceased had not lived a righteous life. The heart was then thrown to a fearsome creature known as Amenet, the devourer.
It's your worst nightmare come true. And it just waits there with its mouth open for this little morsel to be thrown to it. And if the heart of the deceased is thrown to Amenet, it's eaten, and you are dead, annihilated, finito, done. There's no second chance, no third strike. Your life is over.
For most Egyptians, the prospect of judgment after death served as a kind of moral compass while they were living.
You had to show that you had lived in such a way during life that you were an acceptable member of society. This is not a religious judgment, it's a societal judgment.
The deceased who had been rewarded with eternal life were regarded as part of the cosmos, blessed spirits whose presence could be felt by the living.
We know from different types of texts that people would call upon their dead relatives for help, whether it's things like a legal suit or help having children, for example. And it's extraordinary that this idea of life and death was not as separate at all as it is in modern day. It was a permeable sort of transition. The people who are dead were still available to help you during your lifetime.
Communication between the living and the dead took place in the tomb at a large stone relief known as the False Door.
The false door is an architectural element that we see in all tombs, and it is an area that people will come to pay their respects and show their piety to their ancestors.
It's literally thought of as the door which links the world of the dead to the world of the living. It's not a real door, it's carved in solid rock or stone. Living people can't go through it, but the dead can come through it.
Typically, a person asking the dead for help would write down the request and bring it to the tomb. The message, along with a gift of food, would be placed in front of the false door on an offering table formed out of a stone slab. This letter was written on the side of a clay pot. A dish of food would have been set on top. The writer wants his wife to have children and asks his deceased father to intervene. It's almost as though the two of them were having a conversation.
It's a very curious letter because he says something about two maidservants who he seems to be accusing of standing in the way of his wife getting pregnant. We can't really tell if the maidservants have cast some sort of spell or that sort of thing. We just simply can't say from this document. We don't get the entire gist because it's from two people who knew exactly what was going on, and so we only have the sketchy details.
For the ancient Egyptians, communication with a deceased ancestor seemed perfectly normal and was widely accepted. However, at least one ancient text hints of an era when Egyptians lost faith in their time-honored customs and began to regard the afterlife with doubt and suspicion. The pyramid tomb of the pharaoh Khafre dominates the Giza Plateau, where it has stood for well over 4,000 years. Barring an epic cataclysm, it may well remain here for all eternity, just as Khafre intended. In contrast, the actual funerary beliefs of ancient Egypt experienced continual change through 30 centuries of history. Some early rituals saw only brief popularity before they were totally abandoned. This excavation revealed an extraordinary mass burial dating from around 2900 BC. It was found near 3 royal tombs. All told, there were more than 500 skeletons, members of the royal court who were apparently killed so they could join their masters in the afterlife. The custom abruptly ended not long after these burials occurred.
It would be nice to say, well, it was for moral reasons, but we don't know that that was the case. All we know is that the practice stopped, and probably the many representations that you then start getting of servants in the royal tombs, as well as other tombs, acted as a kind of substitute for the literal servants who were provided to the early kings.
Another funerary practice that changed over the centuries was in the portrayals of the dead on their mummy cases. For much of Egyptian history, such depictions were so generalized they bore no resemblance to the actual deceased person.
The reason for not trying to show a person in a point of time, which is what a portrait would do, is to go against the concept of what the Egyptians were doing for the afterlife, which was time was eternal.
In the Greco-Roman era, attitudes changed. Mummy masks were often sculptural, taking on a haunting individuality. Perhaps the most striking funerary images emerged during the Roman and Christian eras. They are known as Fayum portraits, named for the region in which most examples were found.
During Fayum portrait period, portraits were painted when the person was alive, and they were hung occasionally in the house, and then when the person did die, then they were put on the front of the mummy case.
One of the more unusual variations in funerary custom was the elevation of an ordinary mortal to the ranks of the gods themselves. Imhotep, advisor to the pharaoh Djoser, had earned a reputation for extraordinary wisdom by designing Djoser's step pyramid around 2600 BC. After Imhotep's death, a belief arose that he could intercede with the gods, a status usually reserved for pharaohs.
He really became something like our Western idea of a saint, which is quite unusual in ancient Egypt. There are not many people who are not royal who develop that kind of posthumous reputation.
By the New Kingdom, 1,000 years later, Imhotep was seen as a deity himself, son of the god Ptah. And during the Greco-Roman era, temple inscriptions were crediting Imhotep with nothing less than bringing the yearly inundation of the Nile. Imhotep's fame eventually spread beyond Egypt and survived well past the age of pharaohs. A drawing from Renaissance Europe portrays Imhotep as an alchemist, still a revered figure, gifted with knowledge and power. In the face of such glorification, it would seem there was little room for skeptical thought in pharaonic religion. But there were times when serious doubts arose, when the very existence of an afterlife came into question. The best-known evidence is found in the tradition of mortuary feasts, parties that were held in the tomb chapel of the deceased.
Relatives of a deceased individual would actually have a meal there and celebrate the deceased, who was imagined to join them in spirit. And on those occasions, there was often a harpist who would sing songs that were thought appropriate for the occasion. And mostly they point out to the deceased that he or she is going to enjoy the afterlife, that it's the place of security and rest and sustenance.
However, the text of one famous harper's song, inscribed in the tomb of a pharaoh named Inyotef, teaches a different lesson. The song explicitly questions rebirth, announcing that no one who departs ever comes back. The harper also sings about the great Imhotep, pointing out that despite his fame, his tomb is gone, no longer honored, no longer filled with offerings.
That's a very unusual one because it actually raises the question as to whether there is an afterlife, and points out that all these famous people in Egypt that they know about through their literature would have had wonderful tombs and offering chapels, and nobody knows where they are now.
Most experts believe such sentiments appeared during periods of political instability. But even in good times, the ruins of mortuary temples suggested by the harper's song were actually quite common. Ramses II was among the greatest of all pharaohs and one of Egypt's most obsessive builders. Yet only scattered columns and broken statues remain of his once sprawling mortuary temple. Amenhotep III was another of Egypt's great builders, and his mortuary temple was the largest of them all. However, little remains but these statues. Apparently, later kings treated the temple as a quarry, hauling away virtually every last block.
Each pharaoh was very much focused on getting his mortuary temple done, because it was not just a thing of beauty, it's absolutely crucial to his afterlife that it be done and it be done properly, and apparently they didn't have much compunction about pulling down someone else's mortuary temple in order to more rapidly complete their own.
In all its forms, and with its many innovations, Egypt's funerary religion spanned an extraordinary time period. Literally thousands of years elapsed between the desert burials of the earliest Egyptians and the refined practices of the New Kingdom pharaohs. But more momentous changes lay ahead. The arrival in Egypt of a new faith, Christianity, would bring a different answer to the age-old question of life after death. Few societies were as determined to outwit death as the ancient Egyptians. For 30 centuries, their wealth, their labor, their art and their faith centered on achieving eternal life. Their tombs and mortuary temples are testimony to this passion. But later Egyptian religions proposed different explanations for the mystery of death. In the first few centuries after the crucifixion of Jesus, Christianity began to spread through Egypt. With it came new ideas about rebirth in the hereafter.
The concept of resurrection and immortality that was believed by the pharaohs. They do have, of course, the preservation of the body. In Christianity, the resurrection is through our Lord Jesus Christ and not through preservation of the body.
It was beliefs like this that would distinguish Egypt's native Christianity, the Coptic Church, from the ancient religion of the pharaohs. And yet, for several centuries, old ways mingled with the new. Athanasius, a 4th century bishop and the dominant figure of early Egyptian Christianity, documented some of these hybrid practices.
In the Life of Antony by Athanasius, the customs of the Egyptian Christians are described. People are mummified, and the mummified bodies are kept in a place which is accessible to the family. What we don't know is how elaborate the rituals were around it, what prayers were said necessarily, and what people actually believed.
A mummy case figure holding a cross. This blend of Christian and pharaonic traditions appears elsewhere in Coptic funerary practice. For example, some gravestones display a stylized cross known as the crux ansata. It is derived from the Ankh, pharaonic symbol of life. On this gravestone, a Christian angel shares space with the ancient protective icon of the pharaohs, a sun disk bracketed by twin royal cobras. This headstone prominently features a staircase design, a Coptic symbol of resurrection. During the age of the pharaohs, a similar image was used to suggest rebirth. In another echo of pharaonic religion, Coptic Christians believe that the living can look to the righteous dead for assistance in matters of daily concern.
We believe in the intercessions of saints, the saints who travel to heaven and the people who are still living on the earth, they are connected. So we believe that we can ask their prayers because now they are near to God.
But not necessarily that all they're pleading and what they're asking for us for, that it will be done. They present it. And if it's according to the divine will to be fulfilled, God will fulfill it. If not, they have done their part.
As the ancient Egyptians did for generations, Coptic Christians write down their requests for divine intervention.
You'll find people who write little letters and then will push them down into the frames of the icons. And so, although it's not as defined of tradition, there certainly is a continuing idea of asking saints or people who have special communication with the deity to intercede on their behalf.
Those seeking intercession will often travel long distances, visiting holy places like the monastery of St. Anthony in Egypt's remote eastern desert. Among its many monks was a much-beloved bishop named Joseph, who died here in 1826.
After his death, the church declared him as a saint in the Coptic church, and by chance, after 140 years, there was heavy rains in the monastery, and we have to clean the cemetery. So when the monks opened the cemetery, they found his complete body is still intact. So we have his complete body preserved here in the church.
Visitors to this sanctuary often leave personal notes asking St. Joseph for intercession.
Some people, they write secrets, problems, just the priest, the only one who can read it. And then after we finish the prayers, we have to collect the papers, all the notes, and to burn, to keep it sacred.
High above the sanctuary lies an isolated cave. In the 4th century, it was occupied by the founder of the monastery, St. Anthony. Many who make a pilgrimage to the cave leave behind a note for St. Anthony. In effect, these are letters to the dead left by the living, just as in the age of the pharaohs. But Coptic Christians were not the only ones who seem to have adopted this age-old practice. The link between Judaism and Egypt can be found in biblical tales like that of Moses, the Exodus, and the Ten Commandments. However, the intercession of the dead is not a custom embraced by Jews, at least not officially.
Judaism does not believe in an intermediary between a person and the Creator. Judaism is very particular about the fact that each and every human being should and has the right to have a personal connection with the Creator.
Nevertheless, Egypt boasts the grave of just such an intermediary. Abu Katsiera has been popularly regarded as a Jewish saint since he died here in 1885.
In death, he too becomes an intercessor. He's known for being able to cure people of ailments, but is particularly respected and venerated for his ability to bring on pregnancy in barren women.
Once each year, Jews from the Middle East and Europe gather in the tomb of Abu Katsiera. There, they celebrate his memory and ask for his help from beyond the grave. Perhaps only in Egypt could such apparent contradictions as a Jewish saint or Christian gravestones with pharaonic images be found. Today, Islam is the dominant faith in this cradle of religions. But even now, some 20 centuries after the last pharaoh, traces of ancient funerary traditions can be found in the popular customs of Egypt's Muslims. Cairo belongs to the living. This vibrant city is home to some 16 million souls, 1/4 of Egypt's population. The clamour of their busy lives fills the air day and night. But to the east of Cairo lies a different kind of community. Known as the City of the Dead, it has been Islamic Cairo's burial ground for centuries. Here, Egypt's Muslim rulers built themselves majestic tombs, more splendid than any built since the days of the pharaohs. However, beyond their size and obvious expense to build, there is no connection to the burials of ancient Egypt. During pharaonic times, the tomb was a permanent home for the spirit of the deceased, a spirit that remained in Egypt itself. But according to Islamic belief, the grave is a temporary refuge between death and the Day of Judgment. Muslims hope to be admitted to a heavenly paradise of gardens, palatial homes, and eternal comfort.
The person would be judged on the basis of one's actions and words. And based on that judgment, his or her final destination will be decided whether he should go to paradise or he should go to hellfire.
Tombs of this size, though built by Muslims, actually violate a basic funerary belief proclaimed by the Prophet Muhammad. To emphasize the equality of all Muslims, Muhammad stipulated that graves be simple and low to the ground.
A Muslim should be buried in a tomb that is almost invisible. Orthodox Islam calls for the taswiyat al-qubur, the leveling of the tombs to the ground. The Prophet prohibits explicitly the building of any kind of structure over a tomb.
Muhammad himself was buried without pretense beneath the floor of his house after his death in the year 632. But against Muhammad's expressed wishes, reverent followers hurried to build a large mosque over his grave. This kind of interplay between Orthodox Islam and the impulses of human nature would shape Muslim funerary customs for the next 1,300 years.
It turned out that the framework of Orthodox Islam is a very strict one, and that people just could not follow it. And this led very early on, actually, to development towards a popular Islam.
The fusion of orthodox and popular beliefs can be seen in the carved grave markers that had appeared by the 8th century. Using these large tombstones violated the doctrine of the low grave. Yet, in an attempt at piety, these markers were inscribed with Quranic verse. Often, they were shaped like a mihrab, the ornamented niche in a mosque that indicates the direction of Mecca. From the 1200s to the 1500s, under what are known as the Mamluk sultans, Islamic tomb building reached its full glory in Egypt.
It was a sign of the status of the deceased. A sultan built a sumptuous tomb to show what rank he had had in life.
This mausoleum was built for the Sultan Al-Zahir Barkuk, who died in the late 1390s. At its center is a large courtyard, not unlike that of a mosque, with what was once a fountain in the center. The grave of Sultan Barkuk rests under an immense dome that creates a soaring space nearly 50 feet across and some 6 stories high. In an attempt to achieve the sanctity of a mosque, many sultans built a mihrab into their tomb chamber. Barkuk is buried at the foot of the mihrab. Next to him lies his son. But Barkuk's funerary complex was more than just a tomb. It included living quarters, now in partial ruins. These were built for Sufis, Muslims known for their devout but mystical beliefs.
Sufis not only would perform their rituals, but also constantly read the Quran in order to fill the tomb with the pious recitation of the Quran, and by that also help the deceased during this intermediate state between death and resurrection.
The idea that prayers said by the living could benefit the deceased was also a central belief in ancient Egypt. However, Islam did not evolve from pharaonic religion, so such parallels arose independently, thousands of years apart. This tomb, built by the Sultan Al-Ashraf Qayatbay, is another monument that displays almost pharaonic splendor. Certainly, it was testimony to the power and glory of Qayatbay himself. Qayatbay observed Islam's prohibition of human representation. Quranic verse and geometric patterns were used for decoration, just as in a mosque. Among such designs was the six-pointed star. To modern eyes, its use in Islamic buildings may be surprising.
The star has appeared on a lot of monuments, sometimes five-pointed, sometimes six-pointed. And the use of the star in relationship to Judaism is a fairly modern phenomenon. So its use within the context here in Cairo certainly predates any association with any specific religion per se.
The Quranic verse inscribed in the tombs of Egypt's Muslim rulers might seem reminiscent of the pyramid texts carved in the burial chambers of the pharaohs. However, it is important to note that the use of text by Muslims arose from Muhammad's ban on human representation, not from ancient pharaonic custom. Still, in terms of their majestic size, these Mamluk tombs have more in common with the funerary monuments of the pharaohs than the humble graves dictated by Muhammad. Yet despite their splendor, these tombs did fulfill an important Islamic funerary belief.
In Islam, Muslims are reminded that once you die, your link to this world is cut, except via three signs of benediction, so as to say: a child that you have raised well, a useful knowledge that you will leave behind, and benediction, forms of benediction.
Benedictions are gifts that Muslims leave to their community, legacies of the dead to the living. Barkuk's benediction was to provide living areas for Sufis. In his complex, Qayatbay included a madrasa, a school for teaching the Quran. In the 14th century, this was a hospital that treated every ailment then known to science. It was provided to the Muslim community for use without cost, a funerary benediction of the Sultan Al-Mansur Qala'un. The closest parallel between beliefs popular among certain Muslims and the ancient religion of the pharaohs is the veneration of saints. Perhaps the most revered is the Imam Shafi'i, interred within this mausoleum. Shafi'i is counted among Islam's most respected theologians, having founded one of its 4 schools of legal thought. He died in the year 820 and was buried in a low grave as dictated by Orthodox Islam. The ornate mausoleum was built centuries later. In a practice suggesting both Pharaonic religion and Coptic Christianity, Muslims leave notes and letters at the Imam's burial vault, hopeful that he will plead their case before God.
The problems addressed in those letters are everyday problems that everybody has. That is, marriage problems, health problems. Somebody wants children and can get children. All these problems are brought forward and presented to the saint.
The tomb of Imam Shafi'i, like the mosque built over Muhammad's grave, is an example of the curious meeting ground of orthodox and popular faith.
Shafi'i was a legal authority of early 9th century Cairo, and he was well familiar with the prohibitions against the veneration of saints that had been given by the Prophet, and he would have been shocked if he would have known that pilgrims come and have a ritual of leaving letters at his tomb.
Well, the Quranic position is very clear on that. Quran says, "Man zal ladhi yashfa'u indahu illa bi'izni." There is no blessings that comes from human being except with the will of God. And what is happening in the Shafi'i tomb, it brings us to the issue of the interplay of cultures with the faith. What has happened is that some of the old traditions of Egypt have gone in and found a new meaning in the faith itself.
Though the pharaohs have long since passed from the scene, their ancient traditions still reverberate today. It may be that human beings share a universal need to reach across the void that separates the living and the dead. Such an impulse is certainly understandable, given the apparent finality of death itself. Over the centuries, Egypt's many religions wrestled with life's ultimate mystery, and each, in its own fashion, was able to explain death and show believers a bridge to the eternal.
For many years, experts viewed magic as deviant, illegal, and anti-religious. Today, however, research suggests that magic may have been an accepted way to dodge bad luck and achieve good. Magic was at the heart of ancient Egyptian religion and remained popular in Egypt's Coptic, Jewish, and Islamic communities. Stay tuned as Egypt, land of the gods, continues.
To modern ears, magic conjures up images of forbidden rituals, sinister rites performed by evil wizards in pursuit of disreputable ends. But in ancient Egypt, nothing could have been further from the truth. For virtually every Egyptian, from pharaoh to farmer, magic was a potent weapon against misfortune.
Magic is practical religion. It's down-to-earth religion. Magic is religion where the rubber is hitting the road, where the everyday needs and wants and hopes and fears of people are in fact being addressed.
We find spells designed to increase agricultural productivity. There are many spells designed to complement medical practices. You find magical spells as well for cursing individuals or whole families. And in later times, beginning in the Ramessid period, you find spells for love.
In the Egyptian view, magic was as old as the cosmos. In fact, it was the spark that energized creation. According to the best known of Egypt's creation myths, the god Re-Atum brought the universe into being by speaking the names of all things. But it was his firstborn son, Heka, who infused these words with vital energy, bringing to life the cosmos and all the other deities.
Heka functions by empowering imagery. It has been suggested that the name Heka itself means the one who consecrates images, who makes images function and come to life. So that Heka actually is able to produce a physical event from a visual or a spoken image.
It was the power of the god Heka that transformed images of offerings into actual offerings for the dead. It was Heka who enabled temple reliefs like this one to grant eternal life to the spirit of a deceased pharaoh. And it was Heka who made Egyptian magic spells effective.
What he actually represents is the power that makes the universe work. And certain individuals, by appropriate rites and spells and understanding sacred wisdom, are able to tap into this power and also, with complete legitimacy, use the power of Heka or magic.
During more than 3,000 years of Egyptian history, the magical power of Heka was unleashed in state-sanctioned rituals for the benefit of the nation, as well as in private spells for ordinary individuals.
Any magical spell consisted of three basic parts. There was the ritual, what you actually did. There was the text, what you spoke. And there were the objects which you manipulated. Each of these things had a magical component.
The ritual objects used in magic ranged from amulets made by artisans to raw materials from nature, such as lizard tongues or the blood of a bull. Most had symbolic meaning. The charms on this amulet are shaped like cowrie shells, which were used in fertility magic because they were suggestive of the relevant female anatomy. Magic spells from Egypt's Greco-Roman period, roughly 300 BC to 400 AD, addressed matters ranging from health to business to love, and called for such ingredients as the eye of an ape, a copper nail from a shipwreck, or donkey's tears. Often, a spell reflected the historical period in which it was written.
One of the ingredients that might be found in a number of spells is the blood and the gore of the gladiator. If you could put a little bit of that into a vial, you might have an ingredient that will bring power and strength and anger to your own recipe.
Besides specifying the ingredients or amulets to be used and the purpose of the spell, many magical texts included a brief narrative known as a historiola. Typically, these were stories about the gods.
It is a story of mythic precedent. And that story is repeated not just for the sake of information, not only to inform people of what happened once upon a time, but so that the power of that story may erupt into the present moment. And that time may become this time. That power may become the power that helps me.
The magic ceremony itself might be as simple as arranging votive statues, food offerings, parts of plants or other items on a small altar while reciting the magical spell. In execration magic, spells designed to control or harm another person, ritual objects were often bound, crushed, burned, or melted. Often, the actual written text of an execration spell was buried in an abandoned graveyard.
In older tombs where the spirits no longer received ritual offerings, they would be angry and predisposed to take out their anger on those who were turned over to them for punishment. So you then deposit these texts ideally in such a cemetery.
There were magic spells for virtually any human concern. To improve memory, win at dice, gain customers in business, to wreck a chariot, and even for making a rival appear to have the snout of a donkey.
Many of the spells, in fact, were formularies that had blank spaces for your name, so that you would buy a spell and have your name inserted, and then often the name of your mother, because that was thought to be the key genealogical connection.
Among the surviving magical texts were these spells from Roman Egypt, written for a fisherman by the name of Severus.
At the beginning of this particular text, every fishing story you can imagine is recounted. That's the historiola. That's the story of mythic precedent. Every great fishing story is recounted. And then at the end it is said, and as it worked out so well for all of the others, may it be so for Severus, the son of Joanna.
But there is more to the magic spells of Severus. He also asks for a beautiful voice and the adulation that comes with being a celebrated performer.
Do not let them watch me exit, but let them bring me back for a fine encore. Let them shut their shops and come to watch my show.
The picture that we have of Severus is that he is a frustrated fisherman out there with his nets, hoping to make it big on the stage as a performer, and looking for the gods and goddesses to intercede, because apparently his voice ain't all that great.
We may never know if the spell worked for Severus, but his faith that it would was rooted in 30 centuries of Egyptian history. The ancients used magic in every facet of life, and virtually all of these spells can be traced to Egypt's earliest magic, state rituals sanctioned by the pharaohs and devoted to the crippling of foreign enemies. The Nile River Valley is a living miracle, a ribbon of fertility in a desert wasteland. This agricultural treasure was prized by the ancient Egyptians and coveted by enemies in all directions. In some periods, Nubians invaded from the south. At other times, Hittites stormed in from the east. More than once, Libyans smashed into Egypt from the west, and marauders known as Sea People attacked from the Mediterranean. Faced with these perennial threats, the Egyptians raised armies and built forts. But magic was also a vital part of their national defense. Among Egypt's earliest magical rites are execration or cursing rituals designed to paralyze foreign enemies.
Beginning in the Old Kingdom, we have evidence of a standardized ritual that will last into the Roman period for cursing the enemies of the state. This involves writing a standardized series of texts over various pots and then smashing them and ritually burying them, usually in an abandoned cemetery. The reason for choosing a clay vessel is that this harkens back to the notion of the god Khnum, the potter, who forms mankind on the potter's wheel. So any pot can represent the figure of a person or persons. Clay pots are also the basic component of ancient Egyptian garbage, so it is a logical thing to do to create garbage out of these people by smashing them as pots.
Evidence of just such a ritual was found near an Egyptian fort built around 1700 BC on Nubian territory at Mergissa, in what is now Sudan. Excavations turned up broken red clay pots. They were inscribed with cursing spells aimed at the Nubians. Ideally, these would have been buried near an abandoned tomb.
In the case of Mergissa, there was a small problem. There was no antique cemetery there, and so they had to make one. We have the body, the discarded body of a Nubian, thrown aside, his head severed, turned upside down, adjacent to a broken pot, and the flint knife used to sever his head lying nearby. If you don't have an angry dead, you make one. And that's what they did here at the virgin site of Mergissa.
The ritual artifacts found at Mergissa included another type of execration image, the so-called bound prisoner. Made of clay, wood, wax or stone, these figures were inscribed with the names of enemy nations, then burned, trampled, smashed or melted during official state rites.
They're some of the best evidence that we have for geography in the ancient Near East, because they're covered with the names of all of Egypt's neighbors, which were updated regularly, so that the texts were carefully changed on these figures.
Bound prisoner magical images date back to 3100 BC, even before the Old Kingdom, and continue throughout Egyptian history. They were even painted on the bottoms of sandals, to be crushed with every step. In this example, a bound prisoner has actually been fashioned into a door socket for a temple entryway.
If you look at this door socket, you see an image of a prisoner thrust flat on his face with his hands bent behind his back. And a peg hole has been driven into the middle of his back so that as the door opens and closes, it is ground deep into his spine, making him helpless. The simple opening and closing of the door each morning automatically reenacts the defeat of the enemies of Egypt.
Magic was at the very heart of Egyptian religion, practiced by priests and royalty. However, its powers could be misused, as occurred around 1160 BC during the rule of the New Kingdom pharaoh, Ramses III.
Ramses III reigned at a time of some political instability. There was a plot by members of the immediate royal family, by a lesser wife, to place her young son by the king, his name was Pentaweret, to place him on the throne.
Among the courtiers and officials involved in the conspiracy were several priests versed in the secrets of magic. Historical records suggest that they inscribed traditional execration spells onto wax sheets. These were formed into crude ritual figures. As in many cursing rituals, the figures were destroyed in order to cripple an enemy. But in this case, the target was the Egyptian king himself, Ramses III.
The conspirators are caught, and they are tried. They are not tried for using magic or witchcraft or conjuring. That's not the charge. The charge is that they tried to work this against the body of the king.
Clearly, the magical elements were legal instruments because they're part of the royal library. They're part of the basic tools that were used by the state. What is different about that case is that they made use of those not against state enemies, but against the king himself. It's not the act of magic that's illegal. It's the act of treason.
Most of the conspirators were put to death, including the would-be pharaoh, Pentaweret.
We may actually have his corpse. There is a body that was found in the royal tombs, which was perhaps embalmed alive, or if not that, he was poisoned before being wrapped, and from his tortured position, it suggests that he died a very horrible death. It seems to have been the inspiration for the burial of Imhotep in the movie The Mummy.
Despite this extraordinary betrayal, cursing rituals continued to be a central element in Egyptian religion and may even have influenced later cultures. A story in the Old Testament book of Jeremiah seems to have been borrowed directly from pharaonic tradition. Following God's instructions, Jeremiah goes to the gate of the potsherds in Jerusalem, where he utters a fearsome curse against the Israelites if they continue their evil ways. He then shatters a clay pot and repeats a divine threat.
I will break this people and this city as one breaks a potter's vessel, so that it can never be mended. Jeremiah, chapter 19, verse 11.
The rituals of state-sponsored cursing magic that seem to have inspired Jeremiah were also adapted for other uses, perhaps most notably matters of the heart. In ancient Egypt, what was fair in war would also become fair in love. The Egyptian temple was the stage for unleashing magical power. It was the setting for state execration rituals, the place where new spells were composed, and a center for collecting, copying, and studying existing texts. Temple priests were the keepers of these potent traditions. They were its authors and chief practitioners. Yet magic did not stay cloistered within temple walls. Only the highest-ranking priests served in the temples year-round. The others were on duty for several months and then relieved by another team of priests. Up to 5 teams rotated throughout the year.
The rest of the time they were free to conduct their own business as farmers, bureaucrats, or community magicians. So it is the part-time priest with access to the temple rituals, with the ability to read them and being the person who actually composed them, he would be the performer in the community.
In the villages, priests transformed magic from a way of controlling state enemies into popular rituals that addressed daily concerns like health, business, and love. Just as in state magic, such spells would cite a historiola of mythic precedent. Isis, the mother goddess, and her husband Osiris, king of the underworld, were often invoked in spells for romance. Popular execration rites still forced the target into submission, but now for purposes of love, not war.
There is in the Louvre a clay figurine of a woman kneeling and bound with her arms behind her back. In her posture, she represents the classic ancient Egyptian image of the bound prisoner. It's designed as a love charm, although love is perhaps not the operative word.
Love spells. We call them love spells. Actually, they're mainly sex spells. Love has little to do with it.
The Louvre figure dates from Roman Egypt around the 3rd or 4th century AD. It was found in a clay pot, along with a magical text inscribed on a thin sheet of lead. The spell includes specific instructions for the ritual. 13 copper pins were to be methodically inserted into different parts of the figurine. With the placement of each pin, the same phrase was recited: "As I pierce you here, you will think of no one but me."
And what it does is to compel a certain woman to have sex with no one except yourself, and that includes, by the way, not even her own husband, just you. The whole point of this exercise is to make her not romantically in love with you, but helplessly in love with you. And so it draws upon ancient Egyptian imagery of the crushed and helpless bound prisoner. It is a classic application of ancient Egyptian domination spells.
There may have been some way in the village that the word would get around that a certain individual who wants to seduce somebody else has put a spell on her. And she may feel that she can't fight this. I mean, she could fight one person, but she can't fight the gods and goddesses. This is cosmic. This has got to be something that she will have to yield to.
In Greco-Roman Egypt, spells for sexual conquest were often placed in neglected cemeteries, or even inside a corpse.
This goes back to the basic ancient Egyptian notion of cursing your enemy by putting them or associating them with abandoned cemeteries and the unhappy dead. So for a proper fee or by using the priest himself, these could be inserted in the catacombs into the mouth of a corpse.
In one such curse, the petitioner hopes to control the affections of a married woman named Carosa. The text is addressed to the corpse itself.
Arouse yourself for me. Fulfill what has been inscribed and inserted into your mouth. Do not allow Carosa to think of her husband, her child, drink, food, but let her come melting for passion and love and intercourse. Quickly, quickly.
Such urgent spells remained in use even as Christianity began to spread through Egypt in the centuries after the crucifixion of Jesus. Many of those who became Christian monks as adults had been brought up with the old ways. Magic lived on in Egypt's native-born Christianity, the Coptic Church.
We find that the primary people responsible for healing and for amulets, and even for devising curses and binding spells to help men extract women from their closely guarded households, or another one where a mother is worried that her son is going out with the wrong girl, and she curses the girl. She tries to extract her son from that experience. The people who wrote these things seem to have been Coptic monks. That is, literate representatives of the Christian institution.
Magic survives into the Coptic period because magic is something that was desired and is effective for the community. It is not formally approved by the Coptic Church. It never was. And so any kind of activity such as this was done on the side, as is still done to this day.
Like Pharaonic priests, Coptic practitioners would bind ritual figures to compel sexual submission. Typically, such rituals were done for a man in pursuit of a woman. But there could be other targets.
Another way that binding is often given in some of the Coptic texts is you perhaps will wish to render the opponent impotent and bind the sexual organ of the male opponent.
This is just such a spell. The language is Coptic, the reference to Jesus, Christian, but the magic is pure Egyptian.
Episterioma, pamor et kefmuta, et pamor et pre, pamor intau ur Jesus per Christos and hetef higen peshe, impestauros. The spell invokes the binding of the sky, the earth, the birds, the moon, as well as the spell that Jesus Christ used when he was bound upon the cross, to then ensure that, as it says, the male member of fill in the name of your enemy here, as well as his lust, dry up like wood and become like a rag on the dung heap. May it not harden, may it not become erect, may it not ejaculate, may he not have intercourse with, fill in the name of the woman you desire here.
Then, as now, few concerns were as compelling as sex, a priority reflected in the magic spells of Pharaonic, Greco-Roman, and Coptic Egypt. In all of Egyptian history, only one other concern would achieve equal weight, and that was health, especially in regard to pregnancy and childbirth. According to an ancient Egyptian text, the gods gave magic to humanity to ward off the blows of fate. And perhaps no misfortune was more profound than the death of a loved one, through accident, illness, or the fearsome perils of pregnancy and childbirth.
With a high incidence of child mortality, it was necessary to take every precaution, including magical ones, to protect the mother and the young child even after birth. We have a variety of different spells that were recited. The collection is entitled Spells for Mother and a Child. These were enacted by someone known as the magician of the nursery, so there's actually a position for this.
Among their magical tools were ritual wands like this one. They were made of hippopotamus tusk to provide a direct link to the goddess Teweret, protector of pregnancy. These wands often show wear on the edge, suggesting they were used to mark out a protective magical circle around the bed of mother and child. Jars that held magical unguents for the treatment of pregnant women were also associated with Teweret.
What they represent is the pregnant woman in the shape of the goddess Teweret, so that she is only partially human and partially hippopotamus. Various unguents that would be put inside these vessels might be used for curing stretch marks, it's been suggested. You're taking fluid directly out of the body of the goddess of pregnancy and applying it to your patient. It will then have all the power of the goddess Teweret herself.
Such links between magic and medicine are not unique. During the Old Kingdom, some physicians were also known as prophets of Heka, the god of magic. Like love spells, magical healing texts typically included a historiola. Often they recounted stories about Isis and Horus,
The great stories of the goddess Isis and of the god Horus are stories about how Isis was able to cure Horus of a scorpion sting. We find a tremendous amount of interest in Egyptian magic, in averting snakebite and scorpions.
The Isis and Horus myths inspired one of the most potent ingredients for magical healing: milk of a woman who has borne a male child.
The problem is, of course, that you won't necessarily have milk of a woman who has borne a male child immediately accessible. So certain small flasks were made in the shape of a woman holding a child. When you pour milk into that vessel and then pour it out again, it has now become the milk of a woman who has borne a male child. And by appropriate spell, by reciting the historiola of Isis and Horus, it has become the milk of Isis.
This mythic ingredient spread beyond pharaonic Egypt. The 4th century Greek physician Hippocrates also included it in his healing recipes.
It continues in Western medicine until the 17th century, when it is last mentioned in an English herbal as a method for curing various ills. So this ancient Egyptian curing fluid of Isis becomes a standard of medieval and early modern medicine.
In ancient times, Horus was the subject of other historiolas. His epic battle with Seth, the god of chaos, was often recited as the mythic precedent in healing spells. The legends tell of Seth tearing out Horus's eye during a savage fight. However, Thoth, the god of writing and medicine, magically repaired the eye.
And by calling out this section of the myth, you are saying that as this happened in the time of the gods, so it will also happen now to my patient. What Thoth actually did, according to various early texts, was to spit on Horus's injured eye and thereby cause it to be whole. In the same way, the technique of magical spitting becomes a regular feature of Egyptian magic.
The restored eye of Horus was known as the Wedget eye, and it became the most common of all Egyptian amulets. The Wedget eye is still with us today, transformed into the familiar symbol displayed by modern pharmacies. Like the Wedget eye, magical spitting also found its way into other cultures.
Magical spitting occurs also in the New Testament, where in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus spits on the eye of a blind man to heal him in a very similar manner to what Thoth had done centuries before. The notion of magical spitting is, however, so widespread in the ancient Near East. It's unclear whether Jesus picked this up directly from Egypt or whether this notion would have been at home in Palestine.
The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of early Christian mystical texts found in Egypt, also includes what some describe as instructions for magical healing. The Secret Book of John includes a list of 365 exotically named angels, each associated with a different part of the human body.
Thus Bomoka, the left eye. Euronymous, the right ear. Tafreo.
If you have, say, an ache in your shoulder or an ache in your knee, you need to know the name of the power that's in charge of that part of the body. Then you can summon that power to heal that part of you. And it's better if you have a gem, for example, a magical gem. It might be red if it's for the kidney. It might be yellow if it's for another part of the body. And that gem could be placed on the afflicted part of the body. The power would be invoked, and the magic would help cure you.
Traces of yet another tradition of ancient magic were found here, in Cairo's Ben Ezra Synagogue, one of the oldest Jewish temples in Egypt. Jewish law dictates that obsolete sacred books must be ritually buried, or preserved in a depository called a geniza. At Ben Ezra, the geniza held not only prayer books, but numerous magical texts dating from 900 to 1300 AD. These texts address the same concerns as Egyptian magic and often used similar methods. Though Judaism does not formally approve of magic, the Geniza texts are firmly rooted in Jewish tradition.
Sometimes they refer to biblical verses, sometimes they use biblical verses, and in using the biblical verse, of course, they are drawing the power out of that psalm or out of that story and applying it to a particular situation in this world.
This spell seeks relief from a whole range of ills, including headache, shaking, faint-heartedness, and just to be safe, every enemy and any ailment. The Geniza magical texts share an underlying trait with both Coptic Christian and Pharaonic custom, a reverence for the magical power of words themselves. This same spirit would later emerge in yet another of Egypt's many magical traditions, the magic of popular Islam. In the beginning, the Creator God uttered the names of all things, and from those words the god Heka brought the cosmos to life. The awesome potential of words to produce reality led the ancient Egyptians to view writing with both reverence and fear.
Egypt was accustomed to viewing writing as something sacred, something that actually held physically the power of the gods and the stories of the gods. Hieroglyphs are sacred writings, that's what the word means.
However, most Egyptians were illiterate. They had to draw out the power of words, such as the spells inscribed on this amulet of Horus, without reading.
What they would do instead would be to pour water over the surface of the stela or immerse it in a bowl of water. The water would become charged with the power of the spell, and they would then drink the water.
The ancient Egyptian practice of drinking the text of a magical spell reappears in biblical times. The Old Testament book of Numbers describes a magical procedure for testing the honor of a woman accused of adultery. First, a priest sprinkled soil from the floor of Solomon's temple into a bowl of water. Then, a papyrus inscribed with a ritual curse was dipped into the water, allowing the text to dissolve. The accused woman was forced to drink the concoction. It was believed that if she had been unfaithful, God would damn her, and any illicit pregnancy would miscarry.
This harkens back directly to ancient Egyptian techniques of taking spells, writing them on papyrus or clay, dissolving them in water, and then drinking them to ingest their force for good or ill.
Jewish magic also carried with it a great reverence for the power of the written word. And from very, very early times, Hebrew was viewed as not just a way of recording sounds, but the actual letters that the angels had brought down or that Moses had brought down, that God had designed himself. So they're already sacred. They are already hieroglyphs themselves.
Magic spells from Greco-Roman Egypt drew on both Pharaonic and Jewish traditions. The priests who composed these texts were always looking for new names, new words, and new sounds. The more exotic, the better.
Often we find examples of this sort of magical language that begins a prayer or begins one of these magical texts. It will say, Yahweh, Sabaoth, Adonai, very Hebrew sounding. It'll have angel names perhaps, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, or even more exotic palindromes, words that read forward and backwards the same way. They have particularly powerful incantatory values. Abla, Nathan, Alba, Sesen-Gen, Bar Ferenges, Shemesh Elam. Very strange and exotic names, Laelaps, all sorts of magical names that occur again and again.
Egypt's Coptic Christians seem to have adopted this appreciation for the magical capacity of words and letters.
We have numerous examples of simply the first lines of all the Gospels written down together, so that this would be a way of invoking the powers of the Christian God. So actual Christian literature, the actual texts, were used as a form of power.
Coptic Christians also drew on the traditions of other religions for their magic, a process known as syncretism.
In the Coptic magical texts, syncretistic approaches are seen all the time. There are all kinds of names that are derived from Judaism. There are names of Greco-Roman gods and goddesses. There are references to the classical Egyptian pharaonic gods and goddesses, plus all kinds of indications of Christian materials, angels and references to Christ and the divine as well in these highly syncretistic texts.
A remarkable example can be found among the mystical works in the Nag Hammadi library. One text tells of a young man who visits the Egyptian god Thoth. The youth seeks spiritual wisdom through the pure magic of word-sound incantation.
And in this text, the young man goes zo, 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 za, 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 zoo. So there, these sounds are invoked, and perhaps they were spoken for 20 minutes or an hour to invoke a kind of trance-like state.
Even though magic was not formally approved by the Coptic Church, it survived and lasted into the Islamic period. The age-old perception of text as having magical power seems to have been shared by Egypt's Muslims. The evidence shows up in unexpected places. This building houses a Nilometer, a device for measuring the depth of the Nile River. It was built in 861 AD, and for more than 1,000 years, it foretold whether Egypt would face flood, famine, or bounty. Key elements of the Nilometer are inscribed with verses from the Quran, verses about water, vegetation, and prosperity. Some experts believe these had a magical purpose, like pharaonic amulets on a grand scale. Magic also found its way into the popular Islam practiced by ordinary Egyptians.
One thing that you see until today are magic bowls that have either the names of Muhammad or Allah inscribed or a portion of the Quran. You can pour water in it and drink it, and from this you gain a beneficiary effect.
The use of magic bowls is just one of several popular Islamic rituals that seem to employ pharaonic methods for drawing the magical power out of text.
I myself have seen a pious person writing a talisman containing a phrase from the Quran on a piece of paper. He would take it home and then dissolve the sacred writing in a glass of water and drink it.
At least 5,000 years ago, the ancient Egyptians began using magic to smooth out the road laid down by fate. In the centuries since, Egyptians of every faith have relied on magical rites for healing, protection, and romance. If there is one thread that ties together the peoples who made this ancient land their home, it is the very human need to reverse misfortune by appealing to a higher power, whether it be called magic or religion.
In our exploration of Egypt's varied religions, some common themes have emerged. The need to bridge the void between the living and the dead, and the expectation of divine judgment of one's life. Such similarities reveal a chain of beliefs reaching back 5,000 years, and seem to suggest that more ties the different religions together than separates them. For the History Channel, I'm Peter Woodward. Thanks for